Good evening, everybody. My name is Tukufu Zuberi. I'm the interim chair of the Department of Africana Studies. It is our pleasure to welcome you all to the Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture. I want to say a few words about Judge Higginbotham, and I want to say a few words about the lecture, and then I'll turn it over to Dean Sophia Lee, and she'll talk a little bit more about the lecture, its history, and the relationship between Africana Studies and the law school. And then she will introduce our speaker and our moderator, and then we will jump right in it, if that's okay with you all. Leon Higginbotham Jr. was born February 25th in 1928 in Ewing, New Jersey. He earned a BA from Antioch College in 1949 and an LLB from Yale Law School in 1952. He began his legal career as a clerk for Justice Curtis Bach, and later he served over 30 years as a federal judge. He served as the senior judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. President Clinton appointed him to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1995. We established the Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture in 1989. We might be too strong a word. I was here, but it was the colleagues in the program that did all the work, and I'm just here today to reap the benefits, so to speak. I guess we all are, thanks to their important efforts. The Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Memorial Lecture was created to honor Judge Higginbotham's contribution to American law and scholarship. Presented annually in the fall, the lecture highlights topics, events, or figures of historical or contemporary significance within African American and African diasporic communities, focusing on history, sociology, social justice, and law. Now I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce Dean Sophia Lee, and it is my pleasure to introduce her. She's the Dean of the Bernard G. Siegel. She's Dean and Bernard G. Siegel Professor of Law at Penn Curry Law with a secondary appointment in history. We were just talking earlier, and she was throwing down some of that history. Dean Lee's scholarship explores administrative and constitutional law, using history to contextualize legal developments and their future implications. She's a pioneer in administrative constitutionalism. She examines how administrative agencies shape constitutional law. Her 2014 book, The Workplace Constitution from the New Deal to the New Rights, delves into the post-war conservative legal movement and its rights-based strand, now prominent under the Roberts Court. Her work also investigates the intersection of civil rights, labor rights, and racial justice movements. So please welcome Dean Lee.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm going to lift this up a little bit. So this is something you can adjust for yourself just the way you like it. It's like there's that movie where there's someone driving really slowly back and forth. That's a little bit what this does. So try that again. Good evening, everyone. Thank you also, Professor Zuberi, for getting us started and the introduction and the explanation about the history of the lecture, which is wonderful. I want to welcome you all here to Penn Cary Law. It's wonderful to see you for what is a wonderful annual special occasion here for the law school. So hosting the Higginbotham Memorial Lecture is, I think, for the law school, a tremendous point of pride. And this year we are especially pleased to welcome back one of our own alums, Damon Hewitt, Penn Carey Law Class of 2000, and currently head of Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, who is going to be talking to us, as you can tell from the slide behind me, about a vision for a third Reconstruction. In just a moment, my colleague, a newly minted MacArthur genius, Dorothy Roberts, is going to introduce Damon Hewitt. And as you can tell, there's a lot of pride going on here at the law school. But before I turn things over to Professor Roberts, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the extraordinary legacy of Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr., who we are honoring in part this evening. So as you just heard, the judge graduated from law school in 1952. And given when he came up in the law, that meant that he helped realize the civil rights gains of the mid-20th century, which is what historians call the Second Reconstruction. So in light of Damon's topic tonight, I want to focus briefly on that aspect of the judge's legacy. So Judge Higginbotham was a towering figure, a distinguished scholar, a jurist, and an advocate for civil rights who really left an indelible mark on the law and on this institution. Throughout his career, he blended a commitment to the law with the pursuit of racial justice. So he began his career practicing law right here in Philadelphia at the foremost Black-led law firm of the time. But even as a new lawyer who was trying to build a generalist practice in the law, Judge Higginbotham advocated for civil rights, filing the first school desegregation case against Montgomery County's Lower Glenwood Township School Board. Just 10 years after graduating from law school, in 1962, President Kennedy appointed Higginbotham the first Black member of the Federal Trade Commission. And in a telling detail that maps an intersection in the lives of the man about to give the Higginbotham Lecture and the man the lecture is named after, in 1963, then Commissioner Higginbotham was at the White House when President Kennedy called for the formation of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and was also one of that organization's founding members. So there's a nice little intersection. And I only know that because I told his nephew, Michael Higginbotham, who's going to be teaching a class here in the spring, about you coming, and he told me that story. So that is a nice crossover. The next year, in 1964, Judge Higginbotham was confirmed as a judge for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, becoming then the second Black district court judge in the country by a count of just 3 years. There, he played an important role in implementing the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause. And in the case I know him from in my own research, he upheld workplace affirmative action policies against a union's reverse discrimination claims when those were just starting to find their way into the courts in the 1970s. In 1977, he was elevated to the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Judge Higginbotham's appointment to the bench was a great win for the cause of justice. It was also a great win for this law school. In fact, this year, 2024, marks the 50-year anniversary of Judge Higginbotham joining our adjunct faculty and introducing his course, Race, Racism, and American Law. Judge Higginbotham was a prolific academic as well, publishing hundreds of articles and writing 2 volumes of an intended 4-volume series on race and the law that was to run from 1619 to 1964. You might say his project was the 1619 project, decades before the 1619 project. Judge Higginbotham was, in other words, a pathbreaker, a dedicated public servant, a freedom fighter, a field-defining academic, and a truly remarkable man. As a law school, we're indebted to him. Every morning when I walk into my office, I have the wonderful privilege of passing by a portrait of Judge Higginbotham. And for me, as I think for many of us, that portrait is more than just a piece of art on the wall. Instead, it's a daily reminder of the judge's legacy and an ever-present beacon that urges us all who pass by it to learn from him and to carry on his unfinished work. We certainly hope that by honoring Judge Higginbotham today, learning from our alumnus Damon Hewitt, we can continue the work of Judge Higginbotham, who devoted his life to the honest appraisal of the relationship between the law and racial injustice. So I'm looking forward to today's lecture and many years to come of the Higginbotham Memorial Lecture and the important relationship between the law school and Africana Studies that it represents. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Dorothy Roberts, who will be introducing tonight's distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. Before I do that, I just want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping that I've been asked to do. If you're taking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced twice per hour. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. And make sure you're here for the whole event. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your CLA confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, please find the link to the evaluation form in the online chat or outside of the classroom via the QR code. These passwords will tell you how long you attended. Okay. Tell us. Big brother, how long you attended. Okay, now, the first password is Supreme Court, written out as one word. All right, enough of that. Let's get to the important business at hand. I am truly honored to be able to introduce the Higginbotham lecturer for this year, Damon T. Hewitt. Damon T. Hewitt is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. Hewitt has more than 20 years of civil rights litigation and policy experience, including prior leadership roles in the nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors. Prior to joining Lawyers Committee, Hewitt was the inaugural executive director of the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, as well as the chief liaison from the philanthropic community to the White House on policy issues impacting young men of color. Hewitt worked for more than a decade as an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, an education fund, where he was lead counsel on a variety of litigation and policy matters and supervised teams of lawyers and policy experts. One of his most important cases, Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center versus U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, catalyzed nearly $500 million in new relief for Louisiana homeowners. Hewitt holds a BA in political science from Louisiana State University, and as you've already heard, he's an alum, receiving his JD from the great University of Pennsylvania Law School. So a really special treat to have you here. When we met just a few moments ago, he told me that he was involved in creating the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mazel Alexander Chair, which I have the honor to hold. So I'm personally indebted to him. And also before the event began, some of us were talking about the current state of affairs and commenting on how truly depressing they were. And I said, well, hopefully Mr. Hewitt is going to give us an uplifting vision, and I'm so encouraged by the title of his lecture, A Third Reconstruction Toward a New Vision of Racial Justice, which is just what we need. So thank you so much for being here, and we're so looking forward to what you have to say.
Good evening. Warm introductions. I have a whole binder of remarks. I'm going to read all of them. There's some other work in there too. But thank you so much for the warm introduction and for investing your time in taking in these remarks. And I hope that you're not just listening or hearing, but that you take them in and that you can process them and leverage them in your writing, in your thinking, in your activism, whether it be on campus or outside of these walls off this yard. I want to thank, of course, Penn Law School and the Center for Africana Studies, Professor Zuberi, whom we all know from television, and Dean Lee, who has proven quite the leader already. It's not my first time meeting you. I've gotten to see you in action a bit and appreciate the walk that you're walking. And also Professor Roberts, who was a genius a long time before this MacArthur Award. When I'm in this space, I also have to acknowledge people who made my presence possible, not just my parents, including my late father and my mother, who's still with us, and my ancestors, but also Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander. You see, whom we affectionately refer to as Sadie, we see her photograph, or her portrait rather, prominently displayed. That wasn't always the case, friends. When I was here in the law school, the portrait was kind of hidden in the basement somewhere at the bottom of a staircase. It was hard to find. And so I'm so grateful that the decision was made to honor her, to honor Raymond Pace Alexander, not just with the chair, but with portraits that are prominently placed. I believe the judge's portrait is near the Con Law Journal office, where I had the benefit of the privilege of working for the Constitutional Law Journal. I also have to honor one of my great mentors, the late great Lina Guinier, and I brought with me one of her books, Lift Every Voice, subtitled Turning a Civil Rights Setback into a New Vision of Social Justice. I'm in the process of rereading this book, and I commend it to all of you because she knows what setbacks are, and she knows what knew what hard work is, and she knew what vision is and was. I had the great privilege of having the audacity to knock on her door in my 1L year, and that turned into a paid research assistantship for a semester. And I'm glad I did it because she left for Harvard the next semester. But I'm glad I did it, and she continued to be one of the best advice givers I've ever known in my life and career. And of course, I want to honor again Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr., who was a giant not only in stature, but also in prominence and what he meant for the bar. At the Lawyers Committee, all of these people I mentioned, they have Lawyers Committee ties, but of course Penn ties as well. Not only was Judge Higginbotham involved around the time of the creation of the Lawyers Committee, but just to note, when we were created, and I'll talk a bit more about our creation as well, Sadie Alexander was there as well in that room. She might have been the only Black woman from the documents that I can find. I'm still looking into that. So it's really important. But also I should note that Bernard Siegel was also in the room. He was one of the first co-chairs of two co-chairs of the Lawyers Committee. So there are a lot of Penn ties between the Lawyers Committee. And I was destined to work here because I was actually a summer intern at the Lawyers Committee in 1998 when I was a summer after my 1L year here. So lots of connections and lots of ties. I do want to talk a bit about Lawyers Committee, but I want you to first imagine a time when elected officials obstructed justice and blocked civil rights laws from being enforced. A time when the President of the United States was so concerned about civil rights that he, because we've only known he's, as we now realize, took to the airways, the nation's airways, to deliver a televised address about civil rights, and in particular, voting rights. A time when Black people were targeted for hate and violence by white vigilantes and self-avowed white supremacists. A time when racial justice leaders risked their own lives for the cause, and they were surveilled and harassed, including by law enforcement, not just by vigilantes. And also a time when hundreds of thousands or more took to the streets in peaceful protest, multiracial, intergenerational, and even interfaith groups of people. Now you may think, what year was that? That was 2020, 2021, but it was also 1963. 1963 is known as a pivotal summer, in particular of the civil rights movement and the civil rights era. 63 saw murders, bombs, beatings, jailing, threats of those who sought an equal society. It also witnessed the collective public rise up through open demonstrations and join public actions that sought to expose and end racial discrimination, and racial segregation and subjugation. Think about this short litany that happened just before the Lawyers Committee was created. June 11th, 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace literally stood in a schoolhouse door to block desegregation of the University of Alabama, to stop two students, James Hood and Vivian Malone, from registering. Vivian Malone happens to be the sister-in-law of Eric Holder, who was Attorney General of the United States. That same day, President Kennedy took to the airwaves to deliver the nation's first ever televised address by a sitting U.S. president calling for civil rights legislation, which will later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its progeny. JFK asked the nation to enact legislation to protect voting rights, legal standing, educational opportunities, and access to public facilities, and more. The next day, in the wee hours of the morning, Mississippi NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was assassinated in the driveway of his own home. All of this happened within essentially a day and a half or so. All of these things happened. 9 days later, President Kennedy convened a meeting of the nation's top lawyers from the private bar. Nearly 250 lawyers made the trek, including Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander. You heard about Judge Higginbotham. On June 21st, 1963, he created what is essentially now the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. The idea was to get the private bar into the game, into the work. Reportedly, the story goes, his own brother, of course, Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, was the U.S. Attorney General, and he asked, where are the lawyers? And so literally a telegram, the medium of the day, went out, and 244 lawyers answered the call. Now, 250 were invited. I would not want to be one of those 6 who didn't make the call. But at any rate, 244 showed up. And just like that multiracial group that answered the call in the streets for protests, this was a racially integrated group. Of the 244 lawyers, there were 40 black lawyers, and Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander was one of them. Now, 40 doesn't seem like a lot. It's not a majority, but it's notable for the day in 1963. Some thought this would be a flash in the pan. I think over time, the founding of the Lawyers Committee has proven to be more of a political project of its own. There were 2 bets, I think, that were being made that day. One was the notion that private attorneys general could be mobilized to effectively advance civil rights. Mind you, this is before we had the statutory frameworks we have today, okay? Before we had that. The second bet, though, was that biracial, so to speak, not biracial, but the multiracial group, there's a black-white binary, could actually join forces together, focusing on the lived experiences of black people. And you fast forward now 61 years, I think we've made good on that bet and that promise. First, in the last decade alone at the Lawyers Committee, we've leveraged over 1 million pro bono hours from the nation's leading law firms. That's in litigation, that's in research, that's also volunteering on the election protection hotline, 866-our-VOTE. I hope you used the hotline if you needed it during the election season, reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and millions more through impressions on social media and digital. The other part of the bet about the multiracial piece is really consistent with our notion of what we're striving for. We're trying to build a thriving multiracial democracy, or better put, a democracy that is multiracial in which everyone can thrive. That's what we're trying to build. It is quite the mind trip to have a multiracial group, for me to look at our staff of 85 people and our pro bono network of hundreds more and say, we are a black-centered organization. This is what we do. Are you with us? And for them to consistently say yes. That is more than a notion. I think that's important. Our contemporary mission at the Lawyers Committee is to use legal advocacy to ensure that black people and other people of color have the voice, the opportunity, and the power to make the promise of democracy real. Voice so that you're heard in a meaningful way. Opportunity that's more than just a mythical ladder of social mobility that's slippery and grease, so you keep sliding down. And power, which we should never be afraid to talk about, but not power over anyone else, power of self-determination, bodily autonomy, safety on your own terms for yourself and your community. That's what that means. That's our formula for what democracy really means: voice, opportunity, and power. I believe this work is more needed than ever. I think, I won't even say the election results, but I would say election season and the shock that some people have, the all others have, the agitation and even some of the adulation tell us that something's going on in this country. I was talking to a group of students earlier about how I'm still processing what's signal and what's just noise. And I think there's some signal here. I think there's some signal that some folks are feeling that something's just not quite right. Now, you got to mix in, of course, your fair bit of misogyny and misogynoir and other reasons. Hey, Regina, how are you? Regina Austin, good to see you. You have to mix that in as part of the reason why voting patterns are what they are. And I speak as the head of a nonpartisan organization. As my friend Derek Johnson at the NAACP says, we're nonpartisan, but we're political as hell. So we do understand what's going on, or try to get the pulse of what's going on. As Manning Marable used to say, a leader's job is to understand their times. In other words, know what time it is. And so that's what we're really doing right now, trying to figure out what time is it? What does the time call for? I think the time calls for a third Reconstruction. Now, as much progress as we've made over the decades, part of what's not quite right is that a lot of things haven't changed. Now, some of these things are foundational. If you just think about it, ever since we've had schools in this country, even before public education, we've had racial discrimination in education, in schools. Ever since we've had elections in this country, we've had racial discrimination in voting. And of course, ever since we've had law enforcement in this country, we've had rampant racial discrimination in policing. In fact, that's exactly why police were created in the first place, to try to track down, arrest, intimidate, quote unquote, runaway enslaved people. So as much progress as we've made over the years, there's some things that just seem so baked in and so fundamental. And that's why I say, yes, something's not quite right now. Something hasn't been right for quite a long time. And our mission is to get these things right, to keep pushing in that direction. That's why I believe we need not just awareness, but also activism. Why we need not only diagnosis, but prescription and remedies as well. And those remedies won't work if they're not keyed in on the realities. And the reality, my friends, is that no matter what a Supreme Court tries to tell us, no matter what pundits try to tell us, our past was certainly race conscious in the most horrific of ways. Our present is race conscious because we live and feel the impacts of racism every day. Our future is going to be race conscious too, but it doesn't have to be in a negative way with the trap of colorblindness. I've had the blessing, some say the curse, of playing at least a small role in each one of the higher ed affirmative action cases that has gone up to the Supreme Court in the last 20 or so years. That goes back to Gratz and Grutter in the early 2000s, where I was starting my career after I graduated from this institution. That includes the Fisher case, where I helped coordinate amicus briefs, over 75 of them, in support of what was essentially a win, at least a win for the time. And of course, it includes the more recent cases involving Harvard and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where our role at the Lawyers Committee was to represent students at both institutions for almost a decade leading up to the argument, and to fight and to get argument time, not for ourselves, but to lift up in the court, in the Supreme Court, the voices of our students, which were a multiracial coalition of students. It was not a win, but we were proud to see that at least there were some dissenters who cited the experiences of students, because it is the students' experiences that matter so much on those campuses, on this campus, all around the nation. We've been taking a lot of L's, though, recently in the Supreme Court, a lot of losses. We've been taking a lot of losses in the policy realm. Something is not quite right. In higher ed admissions, we successfully intervened on behalf of Black farmers who were told they would get targeted debt relief, only to see that challenged in a dozen federal district courts around the country with a nationwide injunction coming out of the Northern District of Texas, which is infamous. We extended in Medicaid services. You know, Medicaid created a rule that, well, there's a standing rule that says that, provides rather that providers can receive bonus points and therefore additional compensation and remuneration if they meet certain standards. Well, one of those newly introduced standards was to create an anti-racism plan, just to make sure that you are delivering the practice in a fair and equitable way. That's been challenged. Government contracting, those programs are falling, and now they'll be likely dismantled by a new administration. The Minority Business Development Agency, which has outreach centers in over 50 jurisdictions nationwide, focusing on helping to promote Black women and women-owned businesses. The Small Business Administration, whose 8A program provided that businesses that are led by people who are deemed to be socially and economically disadvantaged can get a faster track to certification and therefore getting federal contracts under attack. Private contracting, our friends at the Fearless Fund, whom we helped to defend, ended up settling their case, but they were challenged even though they provided really small grants to Black women, and even though Black women receive less than 1% of all venture capital in this country. If our past was race conscious and our present is race conscious, what should the future be? These cases, propagated by people like Stephen Miller and Ed Blum and the like, they have a very dystopian view of the law that people think is kind of fanciful in the nation, but they have a very clear view about people like me. They think that people who look like me are inferior or less than, and they're quite proud to say it. They're also quite proud to pit one group of people against the other. Ed Blum said, and of course Ed Blum is the person who created the so-called Students with Fair Admissions after he lost badly in Fisher 1 and Fisher 2. Abigail Fisher was his client, his friend's daughter, who was his client challenging the admissions policy at University of Texas at Austin. He created an organization called Students with Fair Admissions and is on film saying, I have to go find some Asians. And he pitted Asian students against Black students. Now, I mentioned that I was proud that many of our clients testified at the trial. We had amici plus status in the Harvard case, and we were interveners on their behalf, or they were interveners rather, represented them in the UNC case. They were on record in depositions, at trial. You know how many Asian students testified for Ed Blum? 0. Using people as pawns. That doesn't mean there aren't Asian people who disagree with those policies. I'm sure that there are. I know that there are. I've talked to some of them. But his interest was in using people as pawns to advance his very narrow interests of the law. Think about these organizations like America First Legal and Stephen Miller. They describe themselves as follows: we are committed to an unwavering defense of true equality under law, national borders and sovereignty, freedom of speech and religion, classical virtues, values and virtues, the sanctity of life, and the centrality of family and our timeless legal and constitutional heritage. This is how they describe themselves. So the money phrase here is true equality under the law. And we know what they're talking about. They're talking about formalistic legal equality, not equality of result, not anything that's really about justice. It really seems that they see not only a future, which we love to see a future where racism doesn't exist, they see a present and a past where racism doesn't exist. And their mission is not to end racism via so-called racial preferences. Their mission is to eradicate race itself. Now, I told you earlier that I don't really subscribe to notions of colorblindness, because if you don't see that I'm a 6'4", Snicker bar complexion, beautiful Black man, then you don't really see me. You don't really see me. Not as you want to see me, but as I want you to see me, as I describe myself, as I say and declare who I am and my own identity. That's part of self-determination. And so what I think about when I think about colorblindness, when you try to pretend racism doesn't exist, when you try to eradicate race, essentially these are erasure games. They're erasing not just laws and policies, but frankly, people, erasing voice, erasing opportunity, and darn sure erasing power. This has made its way into the jurisprudence, and it's not new or recent. Consider these two quotes. The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating based on race. Eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Now, to the untrained ear, you may think, yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to discriminate based on race, or we should eliminate all discrimination, all forms. But these are quotes, as you probably know, from Chief Justice John Roberts in two important cases. One is the parents involved case, the case about voluntary integration in K-12 schools from 2007, and the second, of course, is from subsequent case, right? So, in higher ed, affirmative action. So, you have this rhetoric that is masking as if it is completely consistent with precedent and also completely consistent with the values that most of us hold dear. People who are racial justice warriors, but they're masquerading as these values and they are not in line. Although Roberts mentions race in both of these lines, what he doesn't mention is racism at all, as if it doesn't exist. Jamel Bowie, the New York Times columnist, wrote about this. He called it the John Roberts two-step, and I'll quote from Bowie. He wrote, he takes racism, a system of subjugation and social control, and removes the racists. What's left is the mark of racism, that is, race itself. A landmark case about the legitimacy of race hierarchy, Brown v. Board of Education, becomes, in Roberts' hands, a case about the use of race in school placement. In other words, he's taken all context out of it. We know something's not quite right, but increasingly the law doesn't recognize this and allow us to do anything about it. The irony is that it's so much harder for us today as civil rights lawyers to prove up a case and win a case about racial discrimination, because we often have to prove intent, have the smoking gun, or build a case for intent, which is, I'm not sure what's harder, to have the smoking gun or build the case for intent through a standard called Arlington Heights, which we can talk about in class another time. But it's harder for us to do that, but easier for other people to use the same jurisprudence to dismantle things designed to end racial subjugation. It's almost as if race or people who are raced become the enemy, not racism itself. Tim Wise, the critical race theorist and commentator, had something on one of the social media platforms, just I saw it this morning, I think, or late last night, where he said, in light of the fact that the KKK and neo-Nazis, rather, were parading in Ohio, he said, people can actually espouse racism in the streets. Ironically, though, it's harder to prove it, but also people don't want it taught. People don't want to be taught about racism in schools. That brings me to some of the cases that we're working on now regarding what we call classroom censorship. We're working on two cases in Oklahoma and Arkansas. In Arkansas, our lead plaintiff is a teacher at Central High School, famous for the Little Rock Nine, who's been afraid that Arkansas's state law will have a chilling effect on her being able to even teach about what happened with Daisy Bates and the local Arkansas NAACP and those brave students who faced torrents of harassment, intimidation from not just white parents, but also white students. In Oklahoma, we have a lead client called the Black Emergency Response Team, or BERT for short. It's sad that they had to create such a team, but I'm glad that they did, because they stood up to Oklahoma's House Bill 1775, which has such a chilling effect that teachers don't know if they can teach about the Tulsa Race Massacre, which happened to black people, or the Trail of Tears, which happened to our Native brothers and sisters. So what Tim Wise is getting at in his online commentary is that the irony is that racism is still present with us, but it's harder to prove. Racism is still ever present with us, but we're being told we can't teach about it in the schools. Now, I'm glad that we were able at the Lawyers Committee with our co-counsel to secure preliminary injunctions to temporarily halt the application of those laws in Arkansas and Oklahoma, but who knows what happens in these courts of appeal, especially given who will be appointing judges to these courts in the coming years, at least the next 4 years. So the law is not really on our side, yet we know something is not right. We know it because, not just because it's harder to win in court, we know it because of the narratives that come out of these cases the narratives that come with the dismantling of affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which have nothing to do with traditional affirmative action. You know, the law of employment discrimination has not changed, Dean Lee, one iota. Yet people are running around as if it completely has, because they're worried about the context. But what connects these things is the narrative, a narrative about who's deserving, about who belongs, a narrative about the meaning of merit. The kind of narrative that made me feel like when I came to this law school, straight from undergrad, which hardly anyone does anymore, I was basically a kid. I felt like a kid, at least. The narrative that told me, well, you don't really belong here because the person sitting next to you was at Michigan and you went to LSU, and the other person was at Harvard, and you're one of 7 black men in your class. Now, the institution didn't tell me that, but that's what society had to say. That's what society had to say, that we didn't quite belong. So how do we find our way out of this mess? We are being tested in ways that we haven't been in generations. And that brings me to the concept of Reconstruction. You heard Dean Lee speak about it a bit, the first Reconstruction post-Civil War. You've read about it, learned about it, researched it perhaps. When we think about Reconstruction, we think about the manifestations through law. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery except for certain felony convictions. The 14th Amendment, equal protection under the laws. And the 15th Amendment, not quite ensuring the right to vote is fundamental, but ensuring that the right to vote may not be abridged based upon ethnicity, race, or prior condition of servitude or slavery. What people don't talk about a lot is that, of course, that first Reconstruction was really short-lived. It was just about 12 years. A lot of great things happened. It brought my home state of Louisiana its first ever black governor, and the only one. And if I understand correctly, the only black person to hold statewide office in Louisiana, period. So it brought some good things. It brought early members of U.S. Congress. I think there were about 5 at one time in those early days. So it brought us some things, but it was short-lived because of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. As my friend and fellow traveler, Professor Kim Crenshaw, said recently, we were just at an event together this weekend, and I wrote this down because I thought it was powerful. She said that black people who saved the Union were ultimately sacrificed to achieve reconciliation with those who attempted to destroy the Union. And as she said, we were left at their mercy for nearly a century. So after the first Reconstruction, it took almost 100 years to get to the second Reconstruction. As Dean Lee mentioned, the Civil Rights Movement, also manifested by laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act, and all of the associated infrastructure. The Civil Rights Division, the Department of Justice itself was created in the earlier days to address some of these issues, but the Civil Rights Division in particular, created in 1957 through one of the earlier versions of the Civil Rights Act. So we have these two Reconstructions. So what do these Reconstructions mean? There's so many things, but one through line is that there were both fundamental realignments of the legal, political, and social relationships between and among Americans as individuals and communities, but also between the people and the state, as in the government. Radical realignment, right? Before the first Reconstruction, slavery. After the Reconstruction, still sharecropping, but at least not slavery in the same form. Before the second Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws. After the second Reconstruction, a long battle that still goes on to dismantle many of those laws, but ultimately neutering the effect of some of the most pernicious of those laws. Radical realignments that were consistent with notions of racial justice, legal, political, and social relationships realigned. So we all feel like something's not quite right in this country. I'm no apologist for people who I, in my nonpartisan way, think voted against their own interests. But I also believe that regardless of what our political stripes are, a lot of us feel like something's not quite right. As a civil rights attorney, I would be foolish to think, we'll just take the same laws we have now and just keep litigating and we'll get a different result. That's probably the definition of insanity, especially with the courts whittling away the laws that we have. I know that what got us here won't get us there. I know that if all we're doing is defending the past, we can never quite move forward. So I feel quite challenged on my watch, on our watch. There's so many of us who are, under 60, and under 50, I still am, for another several months, who are leading these organizations inspired by the Lonnie Guiniers of the world, inspired by the Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexanders, inspired by the Judge Elian Higginbotham Juniors of the world. And so what are we going to do? I think it's time for a third Reconstruction. Now, I'm not the first person to suggest this or to use the parlance rhetorically or even to map out what it may look like, but I want to share with you in some of the time I have left what I think a third Reconstruction could look like. First, I believe that modern day discrimination needs modern day laws. We do need new statutory frameworks, new legal paradigms, new jurisprudence, and perhaps even new constitutional provisions to address the problems that we're facing. The difficulty in proving racial animus is tough. It's not just the quote unquote black and white segregation of the past. It's much more complicated. We need laws to address things, just the kind of problems we face today. So in the Jim Crow days, we had literacy tests and poll taxes. I do think that voter ID laws and the constant changing of early voting eligibility, signature match requirements in voting, these are modern day devious manifestations with the same type of intent to try to stop as many people as possible, especially people who are predominantly affected, from being able to cast a ballot. We litigated just before this election, in about the 3 or 4 weeks before the election, almost a dozen voter purge and voter certification cases before Election Day. Some people really believe that their best chance of winning is to stop people from voting, often under the guise of saying, well, these people are illegal, or these people are ineligible, or their signatures don't match, or their birth dates don't match. Things are not that are not material to one's eligibility and right to vote, certainly in this country. That continues. We need new laws to address that. We need not just a new Voting Rights Act to replace what was broken by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County v. Holder case in 2013, which got at the heart of the act, the pre-clearance provision, the formula that drives Section 5, which provides that jurisdictions that have a documented history of racial discrimination in voting must seek pre-clearance or prior approval, either by a Department of Justice or by a federal court, for any voting change. So think about all of the voter suppression laws we saw in 2021. Not in every state, but in many states and jurisdictions, those laws would have been stopped in their tracks as a prophylactic, stopping these bad things before they happen. But we don't have that anymore. We need new laws that address technology of today and the future, the disparate impacts of lack of even access to broadband. There are companies out here who are providing inferior service, not fiber optic, but copper lines, but charging higher rates. And it invariably impacts communities of color. Yet, when the Federal Communications Commission adopted, finally, disparate impact regulations where you don't have to prove intentional discrimination, of course, the telecom industry has sued. That's now being litigated in the very conservative 8th Circuit, and I'm proud that we litigated that case as well. But we need a new set of laws to address all of that access to technology, algorithmic bias, artificial intelligence impacts, what have you. But more importantly, we need to get beyond principles of non-discrimination and get to affirmative, or what many call positive rights. Not the things that you just can't have happen to you, but the things that you essentially have a right to. I mentioned there's no fundamental right to vote in the Constitution. The Supreme Court decided in Senator Turner versus Rodriguez in 1973 that education is not a fundamental right. Many state constitutions make it a fundamental right. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Mississippi, they all have their state analogs. In Mississippi, there's a fundamental right to a minimally adequate education, which doesn't mean a whole lot, right? So these are the kind of things. A right to housing. These are the kind of things that are often ensconced in international human rights laws and treaties that the United States has never ratified. And if some people have their way, never will. Positive rights. Second thing we need a broad coalition to ensure durability. I mentioned that in the 1960s, and even you saw it in 2020, 2021, we saw multiracial, intergenerational, interfaith groups calling for justice for Black people. That shouldn't be the only type of transaction we have for justice. We should be in solidarity across, even globally. But that was, frankly, a beautiful sight. And I think a lot of people got scared by that, hence the intensity of the clapback that we're seeing now. But we need those coalitions, which I fear are fracturing right now. I fear they're fracturing. You know, I had a Latino man on my staff. After Election Day, we had already planned a staff huddle because I knew there'd be emotions one way or the other, and boy, were there emotions. He said, I apologize on behalf of my community as a Latino man. And I told him I don't want to apologize for Clarence Thomas. So we got to figure some things out together. We got to figure some things out together across differences, but also acknowledging connections. And it's not just black, brown, it's across the board. So we need that. You know, I want to read a little bit from Lionel Guinier's Lift Every Voice. To our new lawyers at the Lawyers Committee, I commend to them Chapter 8. It's entitled Lawyers as Bridge People, Architects of a New Public Space. As Lonnie was reflecting on what happened with her, she wrote this book after her failed nomination to become Associate Attorney General for Civil Rights, which ended up becoming a tradition of the most qualified people not being confirmed until my friend and predecessor, Kristen Clark, was confirmed more recently, about 4 years ago. She took some time to reflect, not just about that process and what happened with her friend Bill Clinton, then president, but also about the nature of her work and her practice to that point. And so she wrote about how it feels and what the implications are to do the work in a certain way that isn't in tune with the pulse of that multiracial coalition or just with black folks who she was directly representing. And my eyes are challenged here, but I'll get through this. She said, we lost sight of the need to maintain an open and dynamic relationship with the larger civil rights community. It was, after all, the ordinary people beyond the Beltway who had played such an empowering role in both my own life and in the movement itself. Yet by the early 1990s, litigators like me had become like the Washington insiders we were so suspicious of during the 1981-1982 fight for extension of the Voting Rights Act, the last time it was reauthorized before 2006. We reflexively distanced ourselves from the very people on whose behalf we brought the cases in the first place. There were reasons for this. We had become quite comfortable relying on personal relationships and quiet diplomacy, using back channels within federal bureaucracy to fill loopholes left by vague legislation or judicial opinions. Even some members of our own community were unaware of all we were doing. We're just inside the Beltway. Yet in relying on back channels or lonely court proceedings to make our points, we missed important changes as the public grew restless and unconvinced that the remedies of the 1960s and 1970s made sense in the 1990s. This public included some of our own clients. I feel this all the time. We're at such a time again. Our clients want to know what can be done. When I started practicing in 2001, after a clerkship year, I worked on a number of school desegregation cases. My clients at the time would say, Attorney Hewitt, we can't integrate these schools. We just want what the white families have, what the white kids have. They wanted me to enforce Plessy. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I don't criticize them for that. The law had put us in a box, and they honestly felt safer for themselves and their kids in certain communities. But now people are demanding things that are different and more. They may still hew to some of those same thoughts, but they're asking us, what are you going to do with your fancy civil rights organization about me getting a job and a living wage? What are you going to do about all the things that we want and that we need? You know, I've come to believe that these things I talk about, my formula for democracy, voice, opportunity, and power, even those are just words, although I think it's a powerful formula, just words to a lot of people. Because voice, opportunity, power can't just be notions. They actually have to rhyme with people's lived experience. They have to be shown something. That's important for a political party. That's important for civil rights advocates. That's important for thinkers like you all that will bring us the future. The way I try to connect with folks quite often is to personalize these fights. And I'm going to ask you to do that with me just for a sec. I'm going to invite you, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes for a sec. I want you to think about the things that you want for yourself and your life. Health, wealth, career, safety, children, grandchildren, happiness. And close your eyes, open your eyes, rather. Anybody want to share something they thought about? Please.
Thought about my dog.
Okay.
I really care about being able to do what I can now
Mm-hmm.
with the job that I have and everything to provide for her. Obviously, I don't have a family outside
Mhm.
of like my husband, so like that's like.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Mhm. Mhm. Okay, there you go. One more person, please.
I thought about being able to provide for and help my younger sister because we're 10 years apart.
Great, great. Those are beautiful. Those are beautiful. They're normal. They're predictable. Now, do you think those things are like icing on the cake or the cake itself? I think those are things that shouldn't be just wishes and aspirations. Those are things I believe that you deserve. Look to your neighbor and say, you deserve that. And look to your left and your right. You deserve that. We have to fight for not just things that are policy, not just things that are new laws, but things that are really the future that we deserve. But we also have to believe it. That leads me to the last thing that I think we need in a third Reconstruction, which is a new narrative. A rights-based narrative. I mentioned law first, and law sometimes feels like tip of the spear. And I realize that, lawyers don't lead movements, but when movement needs a lawyer, you want to know who to call, so call me, right? Call us. But it can't be law alone. It has to be what Lonnie Guarnier talked about really connecting with the pulse of people, but also a unifying narrative. We're only fighting for what we deserve. It's not a piece of a pie in zero sum where somebody else doesn't get some. It's what everybody deserves. Now, don't get me wrong. This isn't lift all boats, right? This is more the distinction between formal equality and what equity or justice looks like. It may not look the same for every person, right? To get you safe, sir, may be different what it makes you safe, ma'am, right? But you both deserve safety and health and wealth. So there can be this very somewhat abstract, but it's a unifying concept, the future we deserve for what that third Reconstruction can look like. So what would it take in law, in policy, in culture, in reality, for those things that you want, those things I believe you deserve, that you believe you deserve now, if you didn't before? What would it take to make those things true? Or even if you don't think the law is going to lead the way, what laws or legal frameworks are consistent with helping you to get that future you deserve? I'm going to quote an unlikely source, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Many people adore and love him. He also loved to use the N-word in private conversation, so he's a complicated soul. But he gave a commencement address at Howard University in 1964, I think it was, and he said something really interesting. He said, it's not just enough to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. This is the next and most profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equality, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. If you put that in modern language, you may say justice, or you may say some other language. But the concept, I think, is still very powerful, and I think he was really onto something. And I hope that was more than just a speech, because it means a lot to me. That I fight not just to make sure you all get equal opportunity and then to turn my back and see you all slide down those mythical ladders of opportunity. I fight to get the results. Civil rights today, and I think always has been, a results-oriented business. That's why I stay sick to my stomach so often, because the results are harder to get. This is why I think we need new paradigms. Now, as I was telling Dean Lena, some others earlier, I'll be 50 next year, which means I have about 20 to 25 years of really super productive time on this planet in this career. Hopefully not a life, but in this career. And so I'm now at the point, I'm halfway through what could be a 50-year career, Lord willing. So I now have to think about, how do I make sure that the people who come behind me or the people alongside me, how am I giving them something? Because I know by the time you're in my shoes, what got you there won't get you to the next place. So it's never too early for us to start thinking about that. Why do I have any kind of hope at all? A couple of reasons. One, I think about the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A number of us go to Selma, Alabama every year to commemorate Bloody Sunday, but more importantly, the foot soldiers for justice who marched across that bridge. People who were beaten, had skulls cracked, or were threatened, even if they weren't hit. And so a few years ago, we were marching across that bridge. I think it was the year that President Biden was there. And it just kind of struck me that the bridge is really physically steep. So it means like you actually cannot see what's on the other side of the bridge before you get to the apex. And it seemed like a metaphor for me in a couple of ways. One is that you never know what's on the other side, but you have to keep marching, But I think about progress and promise. John Lewis, Amelia Boynton, and other civil rights advocates and foot soldiers, they had to know, because there were some scouts, that there was something bad waiting for them on the other side. But as I marched comfortably with President Biden and Secret Service and, the people who were in front for the cameras and what have you, I had a pretty good confidence I wasn't going to be beaten or killed. So maybe that's some progress. So I think about, if they could keep marching knowing what was probably awaiting them, why can't I? Why can't we? In fact, who are we to stop marching? Who are we to stop thinking? Who are we to stop dreaming? For any of you who are despondent about the election results, if you're a law student, I would say, great, that's fine. But don't be despondent that a candidate lost, because it's never about them. It's been about us all along. Whether you go into a law firm or go into a civil rights organization, I want you in this work, whether it be pro bono or whether it be actively day-to-day. I want you in this movement. I wrote something to my staff, I guess it was the day after the election because it was 1:30 in the morning. But I wrote to them about our formula for democracy. I said that we say that democracy is voice plus opportunity plus power, but we know there's more that is underneath that. In these times, I'm reminded that democracy is worth waiting for. Democracy, as we define it, is worth fighting for. I'm reminded that democracy is a choice, but I'm also reminded that democracy is what we make it. That's our charge, that's our challenge. Can we create and effectuate a third Reconstruction? Do you have a better formulation than I did? I'm sure you do. Talk about it, think about it, live it, breathe it, write about it, litigate it, make it happen. We can do that together. Thank you. You have time for Q&A? Yeah, we do. Okay, all right. Should I stay?
Before we get started.
Oh, I didn't read the...
No, we didn't want to interrupt you. The second CLE password is third Reconstruction. The second password is third Reconstruction.
All one word?
Thank you. All one word.
Initial caps on the T and the R.
Oh, you have them up there.
I have it right here, yes, I do. Okay.
So we do have some time for Q&A. Is the procedure that a microphone will be passed around? Yes. Okay, so while everyone is thinking of their questions, I just want to thank you for a very inspiring, as I anticipated, would be an inspiring lecture, talk, call to all of us. I thought you made a very compelling case, which I absolutely agree with, that we need a new unifying vision that asks, how do How do we create the society that we deserve, that we want to live in? And the laws we have now, as you said, they're not for us. We have to radically change that. I guess one question I have, I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question, is that while we're inspired to create that society with our unified vision, we are in a particular situation now where we have the executive, the Supreme Court, and the Congress, both houses of Congress, held by a right-leaning majority. And so how do we move forward with, under those circumstances? What's the Lawyers Committee? Do you have a strategy that we can use to accomplish the vision that you set out for us?
You sound like you're on the staff of the Lawyers Committee. Everybody's asking me that question. I would say this. So I came to the Lawyers Committee in late 2019, just a few months before the pandemic started. And so what I realized when I came into the organization, I was deeply impressed by the volume of litigation and the win rate, even in increasingly conservative courts. And so I realized that part of the strategy was to pick some fights, and you won't win all of them, but we have to pick some fights. We can't overthink or outthink ourselves. There are also things that we can do to, if not stop, slow down a radical digression, a radical deconstruction of even existing paradigms. But also, I think one of the lessons we learned is that we have to devote some energy to what go forward looks like, because I realized I've been in the process of rebuilding the Lawyers Committee, not from scratch, of course, because we have such a decades-long history, but for a different type of wartime, because we were built for 4 years for I won't say an anti-Trump, but an anti-Trump agenda wartime. And now we have to figure out what the balance is right now. So I would say we'll be using, I'm sure, things like the Administrative Procedures Act to try to slow some things down on what some may say are technical grounds, agency action. So one of the ironies is, as you know, Professor Roberts, many of you know, that one of the wild things about conservative jurisprudence and the case that's known as Loper-Bright, which is about the Chevron deference doctrine. Mike Fitz was my admin teacher. He was actually pretty good, I have to say, an admin as a former Reagan White House OLC staffer. But the Chevron, the notion that federal agencies deserve deference in their decision-making and rulemaking has been not fully scuttled, but sufficiently scrambled. The irony is that the Trump years in this court has made the executive stronger while weakening federal agencies. They call it the notion of the singular executive, I guess is a theory. Is that right? I think that's what it's unitary. Thank you. I know I had the wrong word. Unitary executive. And so what will be interesting is the agencies are ostensibly weaker, but the action that the president can take is through the agencies. So what is that going to mean? Maybe that ironically helps us out a little bit. Some have a different approach. Some say, well, scuttling of Chevron brings us back to pre-Chevron days. So maybe there's even more discretion, which is a little wacky, but some people are talking about that. So at any rate, I think that we have to focus on the agencies. I'm going to let my cat out of the bag. I'm looking at people who I get calls or texts every day, people looking for jobs because they don't know what to do or where to go. And if I get the resources, I want to create a peaceful army of private attorneys general who know exactly how every agency that we focus on works so that we can be ready for these next 4 years, but still leave room to build and dream for that future.
Well, you had a good answer, good concrete answer. Okay, I will let the people with the microphones, let me just mention the third word is racial justice. Okay, all spelled out. Thank you.
Of course. There are no stupid questions.
Hi, I had a question. Earlier you mentioned how the recent laws shifting when you can register to vote, the signatures, basically are the same as the poll taxes from back in the day, and that they certainly have the same intent. I'm curious about, as we consider a third Reconstruction and changing our statutes, where does intent fit in with this? Do we only care about systems that intend to discriminate, or do we have to throw that idea out and look more at effect?
Thank you for asking. I should have been clearer. It's all about structural discrimination. It's all about disparate impacts, not just based upon statistical analyses, but based upon context and lived experience. You know, I will say, though, I don't want to ever abandon. I mean, I love bringing intent claims alongside when you still can't bring a disparate impact claim. There's very few statutes that allow us to do it, because intent claims allow you to tell and build a story. You have to. Like, why is this happening? Like, what's going on? But that's also a cousin of some of the disparate impact analyses as well, to show that something is happening that doesn't feel right. And then you explain and establish the context of why, through empirical analysis, through demonstrating deviations from prior practice, and what have you. But I do not believe that we should be forced to prove only intent. There's a case that really has defined, limited in some ways what I've been able to do in my time practicing, and that's a case called Alexander v. Sandoval in 2001. Remember, I graduated in 2000. By the time I finished the clerkship, we got Sandoval. And that's a case that provides, there's a statute Title VI of the Civil Rights Act provides that any institution that receives federal funds cannot engage in racial discrimination. But in Sandoval, the Supreme Court determined that there's no private right of action for individual citizens or groups of people in the private sector to sue to enforce that. Only the federal government can enforce disparate impact through its regulations. Even those regulations are probably going to be challenged as unconstitutional as well. So we need robust disparate impact, ways to address structural discrimination across the board, not just intent, but we want to use both.
Hello, my name is Nadira Branch. I'm non-lawyer here. I have a question about our role in participating in this third Reconstruction if we're not lawyers. Like, how can we support the work, besides obviously voting and so forth, but in tangible ways?
I think that setting the agenda and the platform, lawyers advocate for something and defend something. You know, for those of you who are in law school or who are lawyers, you know that we're taught in professional responsibility classes that the client determines the objectives, the lawyer determines the means. But as cause lawyers, we mix that up. We remix that because we have something to say about the objectives too. But we have to remember what Lonnie Grenier warned us about, of us kind of leading the way so much so that we don't have an understanding of what the demands and needs are. So part of your role is to get in the business of needs and demands, right? To articulate those, to socialize those, to connect with other like-minded people, to lift and raise those up, and not just demands where we want X law, but demands like, this is how I want to be able to live. This is the future I deserve. So to be vocal and articulate about that, and I think you'll find a lot of people with aligned wants, desires, values, and sense of belief in those things as well. So whatever platform, whether it's your political home or whether it's, home for activism, what have you, I think we need everyday people to lift that up, but the hierarchy of needs bedevils us because people are exhausted, people are tired, people are scared, people want to keep their heads low. And I know it's never been a majority of people. It wasn't like that all of Black Montgomery was in the bus boycott, that every person was actively doing it, right? It's not as if every Black child was arrested in certain cities when they were protesting. So I'm not saying that everybody's going to do everything, but we do need more people vocal. And look, I think that people are vocal, but sometimes it's convenient vocality. It's, with the thumbs and the fingers. And I'm not meaning to denigrate that, but we need a bit more connectivity. I think everyone can be a leader in this day and age with the platforms we have, but we need more connectivity. And connectivity may not be through an organization or a political party. It may look a little different in the coming years, but we need more connectivity.
I have a question about coalition building across different racial groups, and also just different groups that may not presently see the way that our destinies are kind of like intertwined and interconnected, and our interests are intertwined and interconnected. I think when I think about the civil rights movement, there was a lot of there were interracial coalitions that work together for progress. That's the only way it's possible. But I think now there is a level of individualism within different groups that it's like, well, I'm worried about my particular family, or I'm worried about my particular city, and people don't see the movement as necessarily a national one or one that cuts across race and religion. And I'm wondering how you think we can get back to a place where people see themselves not just as members of one racial group, one religious group, but like as a group of people working together toward a common goal.
Yeah, that's a complicated, it's a complicated question, but the answer may be more, even more complicated. It may be even sound inconsistent, internally inconsistent. So what I would say is, I think that the highest of human experience is not when we see beyond the race or don't see people. It's actually when we appreciate each other and can see our own humanity reflected in someone else, and vice versa. That requires a degree of proximity that as physical proximity, or as Brian Stevenson talks about, he's probably given a speech a couple of times here at the law school, I think, when I was here, he gave a speech about being like kind of physically or metaphorically proximate to people who are on the front lines of oppression, or just have different experiences than your own, but where you can achieve alignment. And so, there's a whole, I think, fairly racist set of theories about erosion of social fabric. And I don't want you to ever think that what I'm saying is about, well, social fabric is eroded, because I think there's some racist tinges to some of that. But I do realize that my family would sit around, forgive me for this, we would watch, Cosby Show in a different world. And I was rest assured that most of the black kids I went to school with were watching the same, because I happen to know that they had televisions. They were fortunate to have TVs. But now, I don't know what the next black person is watching. The identity, racial identity is more complex. And then you take it to your question, across identity, even with identity being malleable, it's a tougher thing. So what I said about unifying vision, I really do believe, but I don't have a clarity on what are those platforms for that connectivity. Like, I think some of the get right that has to happen right now within black communities, between black and brown, between and among black, brown, white, Jewish, what have you, there's no one continue to hold it. Anti-Defamation League can't hold it. They burn themselves. NAACP can't hold it, as amazing as I think the organization is, because of the identity and the brand. The Democratic Party can't hold it, the Republican Party can't hold it, and I don't think there's a signal, again, nonpartisan organization, that black people are now shifting to become Republicans. I think there is at least momentary, perhaps longer term thing. Like, how you have a North and South pole on magnets and they attract? This is almost like, imagine there's like 20 different types of poles and they all attracted. Will they actually stay together long term? I don't know. But I think that there is a void right now that's waiting to be filled. So essentially, I don't really have an answer to your question except to say it's deeply complicated. And I do think one thing that will matter a lot is technology and access thereto, or ability to use and navigate it, because that's how a lot of people get information these days, through social media. Unfortunately, a lot of it is mis- and disinformation. Or even if it's true, it is throttled into certain echo chambers to get people not just believing a certain way, but acting in certain ways as well. So I think that we're going to be really challenged, and we need new ways to connect. That's all I can say.
Please join me in thanking Damon, Hewitt for such a wonderful conversation and presentation. Join me in thanking him for that. Okay, have a wonderful evening.